The baby's skin was the color of a bruised plum. Alara pressed her palm harder against the tiny mouth. She felt the wet heat of a muffled whimper against her skin. Her own heart was a hammer hitting a hollow chest. Ash drifted down from the ceiling. It looked like gray snow in the dark. It settled on her eyelashes and stung her eyes. It tasted like her life ending. The smell of the farmhouse was the smell of hair and pine and old memories burning to nothing. Above her, the floorboards groaned. Someone was heavy. Someone was careful. The wood cracked under a boot. It sounded like a bone breaking in the quiet. Alara closed her eyes and held the child so tight. His ribs felt like small birds under her arm. She prayed to a God she did not believe in anymore. She prayed for the baby to stay silent. She prayed for the smoke to take them before the men did. The footsteps stopped right above her head. A thin stream of gray light cut through the gaps in the burnt timber. She saw a shadow. It was big and wide. It was shaped like a man who knew how to kill. The shadow moved. A floorboard was lifted away with a screech of rusty nails. Alara pulled back into the dirt of the crawlspace. Her throat was tight with a scream she couldn't let out. A face appeared in the gap. It was not the face of the men who had come with the torches. This face was mapped with scars and covered in the dust of a long road. The man wore a worn duster that smelled of tobacco and rain. He held a lantern low. The light spilled over Alara and the child. He did not pull a gun. He did not call out to the others. He just stared at her with eyes that looked like cold iron. "They gone?" Alara whispered. Her voice was a ghost of a sound. "For now," the man said. "Who are you?" "A man with a horse. You want to live?" "My husband is in the yard. Arthur is out there. He's dead. The kid ain't. Stand up. You don't know that. You didn't see him." "I saw him. I saw what they did. Now get out of the dirt." The man reached down. His hand was calloused and rough. Alara hesitated for a heartbeat. She looked at the child in her arms. The baby's eyes were open now. They were dark and calm. They were the only calm thing in the world. She reached up and took the stranger's hand. He pulled her up through the hole in the floor with a strength that felt like a machine. She stumbled onto the blackened floor of her kitchen. The table where they had eaten breakfast was a pile of charcoal. The curtains were lace ghosts. She looked toward the open door. The yard was a hazy gray. She could see a shape near the well. It was still. "Don't look," the man said. He was a good man. Good men die first in this valley. "Move your feet. Why are you helping me?" "I don't like the smell of burning houses. It sticks to the clothes. You're a drifter. I'm whatever I need to be. Right now, I'm your only chance. They'll come back for the deed. They didn't find it. Then we don't have much time." Vance stepped over a fallen beam and led her through the skeleton of the house. The heat was still rising from the cellar. It felt like the earth was breathing out a fever. They stepped onto the porch. The air outside was sharp and cold. It hit Alara like a physical blow. She staggered and the man caught her by the elbow. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He didn't pat her shoulder. He just held her upright until her legs remembered how to work. He pointed toward the dense tree line at the edge of the clearing. A tall black horse stood there. It was saddled and ready. The animal flicked its ears and stamped a hoof into the soft mud. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I grew up on a ranch. Can you ride with a kid in one arm and a grudge in the other?" "I can do whatever I have to." "Good. Because they're coming back with dogs." Enough to finish what they started. "The mayor doesn't like loose ends. Corbin sent you. Corbin doesn't know I exist. If he did, I'd be in the yard with Arthur. You have a name? Vance. I'm Alara. I know who you are. Everyone knows the widow now." The word felt like a knife in her side. Widow. It was a new name. It was a heavy name. She looked at the house one last time. The roof gave way and a shower of sparks flew into the air. They looked like orange fireflies dancing in the wreckage. Everything she had owned was in that fire. Her wedding dress, her mother's letters. The cradle Arthur had carved from oak. It was all ash. She turned her back on the flames. She followed Vance across the yard. She tried not to look at the shape by the well. She kept her eyes on the horse. The baby started to whimper. It was a small, thin sound. It sounded like a warning. Quiet him, Vance said. He's hungry. He's scared. The dogs will hear him before they see us. I'm trying. Try harder. Life is a quiet business from here on out. They reached the trees. The shadows of the pines were long and jagged. The woods felt old. They felt like they were watching. Vance grabbed the horse's bridle and calmed the animal. He looked back toward the road. A faint light was moving on the horizon. It was a lantern. Then another. The hunt was starting. The men in the black coats were coming back to make sure the job was done. They wanted the land. They wanted the silence. "Get up," Vance said. He grabbed Alara by the waist and lifted her. He didn't wait for her to find the stirrup. He swung her up onto the leather saddle. She adjusted the baby against her chest. The child felt small against the vastness of the woods. Vance handed her the reins but kept his hand on the bit. He looked up at her. His scarred face was unreadable in the moonlight. He looked like a man who had seen 1,000 houses burn. He looked like a man who had started a few of them. "Hold tight," he said. "Where are we going?" "Deep. Where the law doesn't like to get its boots muddy. Is it safe?" "Nowhere is safe. But it's hidden. Will you leave us there?" "I'll leave you when the trail ends." "And then?" "Then you decide if you're a victim or a survivor." Alara looked down at him. She felt the power of the horse beneath her. She felt the weight of the child in her arms. She felt the cold metal of the revolver tucked into Vance's belt. The world was different now. The rules were gone. The political games of the town had reached out and broken her heart. But they hadn't broken her hands. She gripped the reins until the leather bit into her palms. "I'm a survivor," she said. "We'll see." Vance let go of the bridle and swung himself up behind her. The horse groaned under the weight but held steady. The animal was strong. It was built for the mountain trails. In the distance, a hound bayed. It was a long, lonely sound that echoed off the ridges. It sounded like hunger. It sounded like the end of the world. Vance spurred the horse. The animal surged forward into the dark. Alara didn't look back. She didn't look at the fire. She didn't look at the grave in the yard. She just held the baby and watched the trees swallow them whole. The horse's hooves hit the soft earth with a rhythmic thud. It sounded like a ticking clock. The race had begun. The widow and the drifter vanished into the gray mist of the frontier. Behind them, the farmhouse collapsed into a final pile of embers, and the night grew very cold. The heat of the ranch house was a dying pulse at their backs, a red stain on the horizon that the night was already beginning to swallow. Vance's horse, a thick-chested bay with a mean streak and lungs like bellows, surged into the tree line. The transition from the open flats to the timber was violent, a sudden cage of lashing pine needles and low-hanging branches that clawed at Alara's face. She didn't flinch. She leaned into Vance's back, her arms a frantic iron circle around the bundle at her chest. The baby was silent, tucked so deep into the folds of her dampened wool cloak that he seemed part of her own body. Behind them, the baying of the hounds rose in a ragged, discordant chorus. It was a sound that didn't belong to nature. It was the sound of iron and teeth, bred for the singular purpose of tearing flesh. Vance didn't look back. He rode with a terrifying economy of motion, his hands light on the reins but his knees locked tight against the bay's ribs. He steered the animal toward the lip of the Blackwood ravine, a jagged gash in the earth where the silt was loose, and the drop was steep enough to kill a man who didn't know the terrain. The bay hesitated at the edge, the scent of the hounds catching in its nostrils. Vance leaned forward, his voice a low, vibrating hum against the horse's ear. "Step! Damn you!" The horse plunged. It wasn't a gallop, it was a controlled slide. Alara felt the world tilt. The horse's haunches dipped low, its hooves striking sparks against hidden shale as they skidded down the 60-degree incline. Earth gave way beneath them, a mini avalanche of shale and dead leaves trailing their descent. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her forehead into the rough, sweat-salted leather of Vance's duster. She could feel the vibration of the horse's heart through his spine, a frantic staccato beat that matched her own. They hit the floor of the ravine with a jarring thud that rattled Alara's teeth. Vance didn't give the animal a second to recover. He spun it toward the north, where the shadows were thickest. The hound's cries suddenly changed pitch, turning into frustrated yaps as they reached the lip of the ravine and lost the direct line of scent. "They'll have to circle around to the goat path," Vance muttered. It was the first time he'd spoken since he'd pulled her from the smoke. His voice was like grinding stones. "Why help me?" Alara asked. The words felt brittle, as if they might shatter in the cold air. Vance adjusted his hat, the brim cutting a sharp line across his eyes. "Didn't like the smell of burning house. Makes the air sour." "They're Mayor Corbin's men," she said, as if the name itself carried a weight that should make him turn the horse around and hand her over. "They don't stop. Not for anything, I know. You ain't scared?" Vance finally looked back at her over his shoulder. In the silver-gray moonlight, his face looked like it had been carved from the very shale they had just slid down. "I'm riding, ain't I?" He turned his gaze back to the trail. They began to climb the other side of the ravine, the ascent slower and more grueling. The air grew thinner, smelling of wet stone and ancient rot. High above them on the ridge they had just abandoned, the flicker of lanterns appeared. They moved in a slow, predatory. The mayor's deputies, their silhouettes jagged against the sky like the teeth of a saw. Vance cursed under his breath. He turned the bay toward a shallow, winding creek that cut through the valley floor. The water was black and moved with a sluggish, viscous intent. "Keep your feet up," he commanded. He forced the bay into the water. The animal let out a sharp, pained huff as the freezing current hit its chest. Alara pulled her legs higher, the cold radiating off the water like a physical blow. The creek was a graveyard of smooth stones and drowned branches. Every step the horse took was a gamble. One slip would mean a broken leg for the animal and a cold grave for the three of them. The lanterns on the ridge slowed. Alara watched them through the screen of bare willow branches. She could almost feel their eyes. The cold, bureaucratic hunger of men who saw people as entries on a ledger. She bit her lower lip, the copper taste of blood filling her mouth as she fought the urge to shiver. If she started shaking, she feared she would never stop. She had to be still. She had to be stone. The baby shifted against her, a small, soft movement that felt like a miracle. "Nearly there," Vance whispered. They followed the creek for a mile, the water masking the sound of the hooves and washing away the trail of their passage. Finally, Vance steered the horse up a steep bank, where the pine needles were thick enough to muffle their footfalls. The forest here was different. The trees were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, draped in gray moss that hung like funeral shrouds. The wind didn't whistle here. It groaned. They broke into a small, suffocating clearing. In the center sat a cabin that looked less built and more grown from the earth. The cedar shingles were curling like dead leaves, and the porch had a heavy, tired sag to it, as if the house were slowly sinking into the mud. The horse's hooves finally struck the wooden planks of the porch with a hollow, echoing thump. It was the sound of an ending, or perhaps just a pause in a much longer nightmare. Vance dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the wood with a finality that made Alara catch her breath. He reached up, his large, scarred hands hovering near her waist. "Down," he said. Alara looked at the dark, decaying door of the cabin, then back at the woods they had just escaped. The past was behind them, wreathed in fire and blood, but the silence of this place felt just as dangerous. She took his hand. It was as cold as the creek water. Vance didn't wait for her to find her footing on the porch. He turned toward the door, his shoulders squaring as he prepared to force his way into the stillness of the room beyond. The door didn't just open, it surrendered. Vance's shoulder caught the wood with a sickening thud, and the frame groaned as he hauled Alara into the sudden, airless dark of the cabin. He didn't wait for her to find her footing. He spun back, grabbing the heavy iron bar, leaned against the wall, and dropping it into the brackets. The clank was final, a tomb lid closing. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged, syncopated rhythm of their breathing and the wind clawing at the cedar shingles above. Vance struck a match. The flare was violent, a momentary sun that cast long, distorted shadows across the log walls. He touched it to the wick of a single oil lamp on the pine table. The light bled outward, amber and thick as honey, revealing a room that smelled of cold ash, dried grease, and the metallic tang of gun oil. Alara didn't look at him. She didn't look at the room. She dropped to her knees, her fingers trembling, as she peeled back the layers of damp wool shielding the infant. Her hands moved with a desperate, frantic grace. She pressed her ear to the small, bundled chest. A soft, rhythmic huff of breath hit her cheek. The child was warm. Safe. "He's all right," she whispered, the words catching in a throat raw from the trail. "He's breathing." Vance didn't answer. He was busy at the hearth, his movements efficient and joyless. He sparked a fire, the kindling catching quickly, though it did little to cut the deep-seated chill of the cabin. Only then did he turn, his face a map of exhaustion and old scars under the flickering lamp. Alara stood, her legs like water. She began to scan the room, looking for an exit, a weapon, a reason to trust the man who had just pulled her from the jaws of the dark. Her eyes trailed over a stack of yellowed newspapers, a half-mended harness, and finally settled on the center of the table. There, resting in a clear glass preserve jar, was a piece of metal. It wasn't jewelry. It was a five-pointed star, rusted at the tips, the silver plating peeling like dead skin. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Alara felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin tight and cold. "You're one of them," she said. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, vibrating chord of horror. Vance stopped mid-motion, a piece of firewood still in his hand. He didn't look up. "You were at the creek," she said, her voice rising, sharp enough to cut the stillness. "You were with the men in the black duster coats. You wore that star when you burned the barns. When you—" She choked on the name, the grief hitting her like a physical blow. "You killed my husband." Vance finally looked at her. His eyes weren't the eyes of a killer, but they weren't the eyes of a savior either. They were hollowed out like a house after a fire. "I left a year ago," he said quietly. "Keep your voice down. The wind carries sound further than you think." "You think a year washes it off?" She stepped toward the table, pointing a shaking finger at the glass jar. "Why is the badge in there? Is it a trophy? Do you look at it while you eat your bread and remember the people you broke?" Vance set the wood down and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was inches away, the heat from the fire behind him casting his face into a terrifying silhouette. "I keep it in the jar so I don't forget what I am," he rasped. "And I keep it under glass so the filth doesn't spread to the rest of the house." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alara saw the tremor in his hands, a slight rhythmic twitch that he tried to hide by gripping his belt. It wasn't the tremor of a coward. It was the vibration of a man holding himself together by a single fraying thread. He motioned toward the small rope bed in the corner, covered in a heavy bison robe. "Take the bed. The boy needs the warmth." "I'm not sleeping in your bed," she spat. "Suit yourself. The floor is harder than the chair. I'll take the chair." Alara dragged a heavy, ladder-back wooden chair toward the door. She sat, her back straight as a rail, facing the iron bar. She didn't let go of the baby, but her right hand reached out and gripped the heavy iron poker, leaning against the stones of the hearth. It was cold, soot-stained, and heavy enough to crack a skull. Vance watched her for a long second, then sighed. A sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. He blew out the lamp. The cabin plunged back into a bruised darkness, lit only by the dying orange pulse of the fire. Hours crawled by. Every pop of the burning pine sounded like a gunshot. Every groan of the timber felt like a footstep. Alara watched the badge in the jar, the silver star catching the occasional ember glow, looking like a drowned thing at the bottom of a well. She hated him. She hated the star. But most of all, she hated the fact that in this cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of her life, his presence was the only thing standing between her and the void outside. Just as the first gray light of pre-dawn began to bleed through the chinks in the logs. Just as her eyelids grew too heavy to fight. The silence was shattered. The baby let out a sudden, piercing cry. It wasn't a whimper or a fuss. It was a high, jagged shriek of pure terror that echoed off the rafters and seemed to vibrate the very glass of the jar on the table. In the dead quiet of the woods, it sounded like a flare being shot into the sky, screaming their location to every predator, human or otherwise, lurking in the trees. Vance was on his feet before the second cry left the child's throat, his hand already closing around the grip of his revolver. The gray light of dawn didn't arrive so much as it bled through the chinks in the cabin walls, a pale, sickly color that offered no warmth. Alara sat in the ladder-back chair, her body a collection of stiff joints and aching muscles. She had spent the night in a state of hypervigilance, the iron poker resting across her lap like a cold, heavy limb. Across the room, Vance was a shadow defined by the rhythmic clack-slide of a metal cleaning rod. He sat by the dying embers of the hearth, a Winchester rifle disassembled across his knees. He moved with a practiced, mechanical grace, his fingers ghosting over the steel as if he were reading Braille. "He's back to sleep," Vance said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the sound of the rifle. Alara looked down at the bundle in her arms. The baby was silent now, his face pale and peaceful, blissfully unaware of the ghosts sharing the room. "For now, he'll be hungry soon, and I'm dry." Vance didn't look up, but his hands paused for a fraction of a second. "Well's out back. Take the bucket. Don't go past the tree line." Alara stood, her legs protesting. She laid the baby in the bison hide bed, Vance's bed, and gripped the poker. She swapped it for the heavy wooden bucket by the door. As she lifted the iron bar, the wood groaned, a sound like a long-held breath finally being released. Outside, the world was a study in desolation. The ranch, if it could still be called that, was a graveyard of ambition. The grass was yellow and brittle, snapping under her boots like dry bone. The air tasted of dust and old wood smoke. She reached the stone well, its circular mouth looking like a throat parched and gasping. She hooked the bucket to the fraying rope and began to lower it. The wind whistled across the opening, a low, mournful flute note. As the bucket descended into the black, she froze. From the depths, a sound drifted up. It wasn't the splash of water. It was a faint, rhythmic clink, 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 a metallic tapping against glass. Her heart stuttered. It was the exact sound Silas used to make at night, tapping his wedding band against the mason jar of cider as they sat on their porch in the foothills. Clink, clink, clink. A signal, a habit, a haunting. "Silas," she whispered, the name feeling like a sin in the morning air. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the stones of the well. Alara gripped the windlass and cranked with a sudden desperate ferocity. Her knuckles went white. She expected to see his face staring up from the bucket, or perhaps the silver badge in the jar. But when the bucket cleared the rim, there was only a few inches of thick, gray-brown slurry. It wasn't water, it was liquid earth, half mud smelling of rot and ancient trapped minerals. The land here wasn't just dry, it was dead, and it was trying to reclaim everything built upon it. "Water's bad," a voice said behind her. She didn't jump. She was too tired for fear to be a reflex anymore. Vance stood on the porch, his rifle fully assembled and cradled in the crook of his arm. He looked out over the horizon, squinting against the rising sun that offered light but no heat. "It's all there is," Alara said, staring at the mud. "Everything in this place is tainted." Vance stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on the dead grass. He didn't look at the well. He looked at her. "The Corbins don't want the water, Alara. They don't even want the grass. They want the line. They want the rail access and the deed that proves who owns the dirt." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "They want the deed, don't they?" "Yes," she said, her voice turning to flint. "You have it?" Alara looked at the muddy bucket, then back at the cabin where her son lay sleeping. She felt a phantom weight in her throat, a scratchy, thick sensation that had been there for 3 days. "I swallowed it," she said. Vance's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. He looked at her not as a victim, but as a fortification. A woman who would ingest ink, heavy parchment, and the very legal essence of her family's survival, rather than let it be torn from her hands. She had made herself the vault. "You're a hard woman, Alara," Vance murmured. It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't a slight. It was an observation of a fact as cold as the badge in the jar. "I had a soft life once," she replied, reaching for the handle of the bucket. "It didn't keep me warm." She went to lift the bucket, her fingers closing around the rough wood. Crack the sound was a whip snap that tore through the morning stillness. Ilara didn't feel the impact, only the sudden, violent jerk of her arm. The wooden bucket in her hand disintegrated. Staves of pine exploded into splinters, and the gray mud sprayed across her skirts like a fresh wound. The sound of the rifle shot finally reached them, rolling across the flats from the distant ridge. Vance didn't scream for her to run. He was already moving, his boots kicking up dust as he lunged toward her, his own rifle coming to his shoulder in one fluid, lethal motion. The world dissolved into a chaos of cedar splinters and gray mud. Ilara didn't have time to scream. The impact of the bullet hitting the bucket sent a jarring vibration up her arm, and before she could even register the spray of filth across her chest, a hand like a vice clamped onto the collar of her dress. "Down!" Vance's voice was a guttural roar. He didn't wait for her to move. He wrenched her backward, her boots skidding through the dirt as he dragged her bodily toward the porch. Another crack echoed from the tree line, and a slug chewed into the doorframe just inches above her head, showering her hair with yellow pine dust. Vance hauled her over the threshold and kicked the door shut. He didn't bother with the bar yet. He threw himself toward the window, his Winchester already leveled. "Get to the floor! Under the table!" Ilara scrambled, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. She reached the bison-hide bed in 2 frantic lunges, snatching the baby up. He began to wail, a thin, sharp sound that pierced the roar of the adrenaline in her ears. She dove beneath the heavy oak table, curling her body into a ball around the child, her palms pressed hard against his tiny ears to muffle the coming thunder. Outside, the morning was no longer silent. "Vance!" A voice drifted across the clearing, mocking and high-pitched. "We know you're in there, you old dog. Give us the woman and the brat, and maybe the mayor lets you keep your scalp." Vance didn't answer with words. He kicked a ladder-back chair over, propping the barrel of the Winchester on the rung. His face was a mask of cold, focused iron. "I know that voice," Ilara whispered from the shadows of the floorboards. "That's Miller. He was there at the creek." "Vance," the voice called again. 2 shadows moved at the edge of the timber, trackers dressed in the dark, heavy wool of the Corbin outfit. "She ain't here, Bill says. He says he saw her tracks leadin' toward the pass." "She ain't here," Vance finally shouted back, his voice steady, devoid of the panic that was currently clawing at Ilara's throat. "Then you're hiding a ghost. We see the tracks. Vance, don't make this a funeral for a stranger." Vance's thumb pulled back the hammer of the rifle. The click was the loudest thing in the room. "Then you're looking at your own grave." The woods went silent for a heartbeat. Then, the trackers moved, one darting toward a fallen log, the other trying to circle wide toward the well. Vance didn't hesitate. It wasn't the slow, theatrical aim of a marksman. It was the rapid, blunt action of a man who had spent a lifetime treating violence as a chore. Crack, slide, crack. The rifle barked twice in the cramped space of the cabin, the muzzle flashes illuminating the dust motes like miniature lightning strikes. Through the window, Ilara saw the tracker near the log jerk violently. He didn't fall so much as he was folded, his body collapsing into the yellow grass like a discarded coat. The second man froze, his eyes wide as he looked at his partner. He didn't fire back. He turned and bolted, his boots drumming a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth as he disappeared into the safety of the pines. Vance didn't take the third shot. He watched the tree line until the sound of the retreating man faded into the wind. He stood up, his movement stiff. He leaned the rifle against the wall and finally dropped the iron bar across the door. It was only then that Ilara noticed the dark, wet stain spreading across the shoulder of his tan shirt. The fabric was torn, the flesh beneath a jagged, angry red. "You're hit," she said, her voice trembling as she crawled out from under the table. Vance glanced at his shoulder, his expression one of mild annoyance. "A graze." Lead was traveling too fast to stay inside. He looked at the door, then back at the window. "That wasn't the fight, Ilara. That was the invitation. Miller's gone to fetch the mayor. He'll bring the whole line now. Everyone who's on the Corbin payroll. He walked to the table and sank into a chair, the adrenaline leaving him in a slow, visible ebb. He looked at the glass jar, the badge in the jar, and for a moment, he looked every bit the ghost she had called him. "They're coming for the deed," he murmured, "and they'll burn the house down to find it." Ilara stood in the center of the room. Her dress was ruined, stained with the mud of a dead well and the dust of a near death. She looked at her son, who had finally quieted, his eyes wide and dark as he watched the shadows on the ceiling. She felt the weight in her throat, the sharp, metallic taste of ink and the pulpy texture of parchment that had been resting against the back of her tongue for miles. She reached into her mouth. Her fingers came away red, slick with saliva and a bit of blood where the heavy paper had scraped her throat raw. She pulled a small, tightly folded square of parchment from between her teeth. It was damp, the edges frayed and stained, but the wax seal of the territory was still visible, a stubborn gout of red against the white. She held it out to him. Her hand didn't shake. "They won't find it in the house," she said, her voice raspy and final. Vance stared at the bloody scrap of paper in her hand. He looked at the woman who had carried the legal soul of her family in her own body, willing to choke on it before she let it go. In that moment, the rusted star in the jar seemed smaller, less significant than the piece of paper held by a mother who had run out of things to lose. "You swallowed the law," Vance whispered, a grim ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I am the law," Ilara replied. "Until my son can read that paper, I am the only law that matters." Vance reached out, his fingers hovering over the deed, before he looked toward the door. The sound of distant horses was beginning to rise over the horizon, a low rhythmic thrumming that signaled the end of the quiet. The mayor was coming. The parchment was stiff with dried saliva and the iron scent of her own blood. Vance took it from her, his movements slow, deliberate. He laid it flat on the pine table, smoothing the curled edges with a thumb that had seen too much hard work to be gentle. As he studied the document, the lamplight played across his face, etching deep furrows into his brow. He tilted the paper. It wasn't the ornate, flowery script of a land deed. The ink had been laid down with the frantic, precise geometry of a surveyor's fever dream. "This isn't a title," Vance whispered, his voice catching on the edges of the ink. "This is a hydrology report." Ilara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of red against her pale skin. She didn't look like a victim anymore. Her shoulders had squared, and the frantic, wide-eyed terror of the last few days had calcified into something harder, something crystalline. Vance traced a line on the page, a jagged contour that cut through the center of the valley. "This isn't just about the grazing rights or the rail access. This is the aquifer line, the deep well vein." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "The reservoir is vast. It's the only water source for 100 miles in any direction." "Silas found it," Ilara said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the grief that had choked her only hours before. "He wasn't a farmer, he was an engineer. He kept the maps, the measurements. When the drought started, he realized it wasn't the weather. It was the pumps. The mayor was siphoning the water to hold the county hostage. He wasn't driving us out to build a railroad. He was driving us out to secure the tap." Vance exhaled, a long, weary sound. The pieces fell into place with the sickening click of a lock turning. "They didn't just want your land, Ilara. They wanted the throat of the entire valley. They killed him for it," she said, nodding toward the badge in the jar. "They thought they'd find the map. They tore the house apart. They dug up the floorboards. They never thought to look inside the one place the law couldn't touch." Vance looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the transformation complete. The woman who had crawled under the table to hide was gone. In her place was a woman who had calculated the cost of her own survival and decided to pay it in full. "You stayed," Vance said, the realization landing heavy in the room. "You didn't flee because you were scared. You stayed to trap him." Ilara picked up a heavy framing hammer from the floor, hefting it like a sidearm. "I stayed to end him. You're a widow with a baby, Ilara. Corbin has a private army. I am the owner of this valley, she countered, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying light. And he is trespassing. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The panic that had defined the air since the moment they arrived evaporated, replaced by a grim, tactical focus. They were no longer victims waiting for the inevitable. They were combatants preparing for an engagement. Vance moved to the windows. He grabbed a handful of scrap boards, old, weathered pine planks that had been stacked in the corner, and began to nail them across the glass. Bang! Bang! The rhythm was steady, a carpenter's lullaby. "How many?" Alara asked. Her voice calm as she gathered the extra ammunition from the cache Vance had pulled from beneath the floorboards. 12. Vance grunted, driving a nail home with a single brutal strike. Maybe 13, if he decided to ride with his favorite dog. Alara laid the cartridges out on the table. She counted them. "And you?" Vance stopped. He checked the cylinder of his revolver, then the magazine of his Winchester. 14, a silence stretched between them, a math problem that yielded a terrifying result. 12 men. 14 bullets. There was no margin for error. There was no room for a warning shot, no space for a miss. It was a gospel of lead written in the margins of their survival. 2 bullets left over, Alara said almost to herself. "For the mayor," Vance added, his voice devoid of humor. They worked with a dark, rhythmic efficiency. Alara helped him board the final window, her hands moving as quickly as his. She wasn't trembling. She was breathing with a slow, measured cadence, her mind already mapping the angles, the cover, the way the light would hit the clearing when the sun reached its zenith. She walked to the bison hide bed. The baby was awake, watching the rafters with wide, silent eyes. She didn't coo at him. She didn't whisper reassurances. She simply laid her hand on his chest, grounding herself, anchoring her resolve. She wasn't protecting him anymore. She was arming herself for his future. Vance stood by the door, the Winchester cradled in his arms like a child. He looked at the cabin, now a fortress of splintered pine and shadow. It was a tomb, or it was a stronghold. It depended entirely on the next 10 minutes. Then they heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the shift of the house on its foundations. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming against the earth, a deep vibration that rattled the jar on the table, causing the silver star to clink against the glass. Clink. The sound of 12 horses, moving at a trot, crested the ridge of the clearing. The men were coming, and they were bringing the fire. Vance shifted his weight, his boots pressing into the dirt floor. Alara stood by the hearth, her hand closing around the iron poker. Not to fight, but to hold the fire that would ensure nothing of theirs was left for the mayor to claim. "They're here," she said. Vance nodded. He didn't look at her, but he shifted slightly, positioning himself so he could cover the door the moment it splintered. "Keep the baby low. Don't look at the windows." "I'm not looking at the windows," Alara replied, her voice steady as a falling stone. "I'm looking at the door." Outsa pulled to a halt. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of 12 armed men and the scent of imminent, violent change. The hunt was over. The siege had begun. The silence of the woods, usually so heavy and suffocating, was shattered by the thin, metallic crackle of a megaphone. It was an intrusion of the modern world into the ancient, silent dark of the pines, a sound that didn't belong. "Mrs. Alara," the voice boomed, amplified, and echoing off the canyon walls. It was smooth, honeyed, and dripping with the kind of false rural politeness that suggested a man who practiced his speeches in front of a mirror. "It's Mayor Corbin. I've come a long way to find you. I am deeply sorry for the tragic misfortune that befell your homestead." Inside the cabin, the air felt thin, ionized by the tension. Vance didn't move. He stood near the door, his rifle barrel resting against the frame, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light where the boards didn't quite meet. Alara stood near the window, her hand resting on the splintered wood, her face a pale mask in the gloom. "The fire was an accident, of course," the megaphone continued, the tinny distortion making the mayor sound like a demon speaking through a tin can. "A terrible, unforeseen tragedy. But I'm here to help. I want to see you and your boy settled, Safe. All I need is for you to step outside, hand over the documentation you've been protecting, and we can all return to our lives. Let us avoid any further unpleasantness." Ilara's posture didn't shift. She didn't flinch at the mention of the fire, nor did she betray a flicker of fear at the sound of the 12 horses shifting in the yard, their hooves churning the dirt. She turned her head slightly, looking toward Vance. Her eyes, which had wept for the loss of her husband and the safety of her home, were now dry. They were cold, clear, and focused. "Kill the one with the megaphone," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a command, steady and rhythmic, like a hammer striking an anvil. Vance shifted his weight, his boot barely making a sound on the floorboards. "That's the mayor, Ilara. You know that. That's the man who owns the county." "Did I ask for a biography?" she asked, her gaze drifting back to the window, watching the flickers of light beginning to dance between the trees. "I asked for a death." Vance paused. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since they had met in the smoke of the ranch, the tension in his face broke. A slow ghost of a smile touched his lips. Not of joy, but of recognition. It was the smile of a man who had finally found his purpose in a world that had tried to grind him down. "Well," he murmured, his voice a gravelly rasp, "I suppose that's a distinction without a difference." He didn't wait for her to acknowledge him. He kicked the front door open, not fully, just enough to create a gap the width of a rifle barrel. He slid the Winchester through, the steel cold and steady against the wood. Outside, the darkness began to retreat. The 12 men Corbin's shadow guard had dismounted. They were moving in a loose semicircle, their hands holding torches that sent long, hungry tongues of flame licking into the night air. The woods, which had been a haven, were now a theater of illumination. The light caught the metal of their belt buckles, the barrels of their rifles, and the gleaming eyes of the horses waiting in the brush. "I'm waiting for an answer." "Mrs. Ilara!" the mayor shouted through the megaphone. He was mounted on a white stallion, standing just outside the threshold of the porch lights, looking every bit the savior he claimed to be. He looked at the cabin with a proprietary air, as if he were already measuring the timber for his own use. "Torches!" Corbin ordered, his voice dropping the veneer of politeness. "Burn the brush back. If she doesn't want to come out, we'll make the house too hot to stay in." The psychological pressure spiked. It was the same tactic that had destroyed her life. The deliberate, methodical application of fire to force a retreat. The smell of kerosene began to drift through the cracks in the cabin, cloying and sweet, cutting through the scent of old dust and pine. Ilara watched as a man stepped forward, his arm drawn back. He held a pitchfork, the tines wrapped in oil-soaked rags that burned with a fierce, unnatural orange glow. "He thinks I'm still the woman who ran," Ilara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They always do," Vance replied. He lined up his sights. The mayor was adjusting his hat, the megaphone dangling from his hand as he checked his pocket watch. He was confident. He was certain. He was entirely exposed. Vance inhaled, holding his breath, the world narrowing down to the front sight of his Winchester and the soft, rhythmic pulsing of the man's chest. "Vance," Ilara said, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the approaching torches. "Yeah? Don't miss." "I don't plan on it." Outside, the man with the pitchfork took a final lunging step. He whipped his arm forward, a powerful, practiced motion. The burning implement spun end over end, a streak of fire against the black canvas of the woods. It wasn't aimed at the wall. It was aimed at the glass. The window shattered. The sound of exploding glass was a violent, crystalline scream that pierced the night. The pitchfork didn't stop. It punched through the opening, the burning tines trailing smoke and sparks as it tumbled through the air. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, metallic thud, the burning rags igniting the dry, ancient wood instantly. The flames roared to life, a sudden, blinding column of heat that surged upward, illuminating the entire room. Ilara stood still, the firelight dancing in her eyes, casting her shadow against the log walls like a giant. She looked down at the pitchfork, the flames licking at the hem of her dress, and then she looked at the door. Now, she whispered. Vance squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was a thunderclap that swallowed the night. Outside, the man with the flaming pitchfork didn't even have time to scream. He crumpled as the bullet caught him in the chest, the torch flying from his hand to land squarely in the center of the cabin's floor. The pitchfork followed, its burning tines sinking into the dry, resin-heavy pine of the floorboards. The world turned orange. The fire didn't grow. It leaped. It consumed the spilled kerosene instantly, licking up the walls with a greedy serpentine hunger. Then came the return fire. The darkness outside erupted. Bullets tore through the log walls like hail through paper. Splinters of wood and lead shrapnel filled the air, turning the cabin into a lethal centrifuge. Vance didn't miss a beat. He stood in the center of the room, his Winchester a blur of motion. Click, clack, bang. A man behind a stump outside dropped. Click, clack, bang. A muzzle flash on the tree line vanished. "Ilara!" he roared over the cacophony of breaking glass and the rhythmic thud-thud of lead chewing through the logs. Ilara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the baby, the bundle pressed hard against her shoulder, and scrambled for the heavy rug in the corner. She kicked it back, revealing the iron ring of the root cellar door. It was stiff, rusted shut by decades of disuse, but her fingers found the groove. She hauled upward with every ounce of strength in her soul. The door groaned and gave way. "Get down!" Vance shouted. He was pivoting toward the front door, his rifle barrel hot enough to sear his palms. A volley from the porch slammed into him. Vance jerked, his body shuddering under the impact. He took a bullet to the ribs. The sound of it was sickening. A dull, wet thwack! He gasped, his face draining of color, but he didn't drop. He pivoted, his aim still true, and fired 2 more shots into the darkness of the porch, silencing the shooter. "Come with us!" Ilara screamed from the dark mouth of the cellar, her voice cracking. "Vance, you have to!" Vance leaned against the central post of the cabin, blood soaking his shirt, spreading like a dark ink stain. He looked at her, his eyes wild and bright, reflecting the inferno consuming the room. He looked at the baby, then back at the door where the silhouette of another man was advancing, torch raised high. "I belong in the dirt," he barked, his breath rattling in his chest. "You don't! Go!" He turned his back on her, throwing himself into the path of the encroaching wall of fire. He moved with a violent final purpose. He lunged for the pine table, his hand sweeping out and knocking the clear glass jar to the floor. It shattered with a crystalline shriek. The glass shards didn't just scatter. They sliced through a thick, blackened wire that Vance had run along the floorboards earlier that morning. A tripwire connected to a cache of black powder and blasting caps he'd been hoarding for the day the Corbins finally came to collect their due. Vance stood over the spreading flames, the heat blistering his skin. He racked the lever of his rifle one last time, the click of the firing pin echoing like a bell. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the fire. "Run!" he rasped. Ilara didn't argue. She knew the language of sacrifice. She had been writing it in her own blood for days. She dropped into the cellar. The air there was cold, smelling of damp earth and rot, a grave-like silence that stood in stark contrast to the screaming furnace above. She scrambled into the shadows, pulling the baby deep into the corner of the small, earthen room. She didn't look back at the light. She shielded the child's eyes with her skirt and curled into a ball, pressing her hands over her ears. Above her, the heavy wooden trapdoor was a square of burning light. She saw Vance's silhouette for one fleeting second, a ghost standing against the flames, rifle raised, a final sentry at the gate. Then the trapdoor slammed shut. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the final punctuation mark on a story of blood and fire. Ilara held her breath. She didn't count the seconds. She didn't pray. She simply existed in the dark, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. It started with a low tectonic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of the foundation giving way. Then the world inverted. A massive, violent explosion tore the night apart. The floor above detonated, a concussive wave of heat and shrapnel that slammed into the ground. Dirt fell from the ceiling of the cellar, coating Ilara's hair and shoulders. The earth shook so hard her teeth rattled. The roar of the fire, the shout of the men outside, the thunder of the explosion, it all blurred into a single, deafening void. And then silence. The only sound left in the world was the shallow, terrified breathing of the baby in her arms, and the distant, dying crackle of a house becoming ash. The valley was quiet. The deed was buried. The past had been paid in full, and the smoke drifting through the cracks of the trapdoor carried the scent of a new, terrifying beginning. The trapdoor rattled, a dry wooden percussion against the absolute silence of the earth. Dirt, fine gray ash and pulverized soil, rained down onto Alara's face, coating her eyelashes and the soft down of the baby's head. She didn't move. She held the boy tight, her muscles corded and aching, waiting for the ceiling to collapse again. But there was only the stillness. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a storm, where the world holds its breath, waiting to see what is left standing. The baby was unnaturally calm. He didn't cry, he didn't squirm. He simply pressed his small, warm face against her neck, sensing the iron-hard tension in her skin. He knew better than to make a sound. His mother was no longer a person. She was a force of nature, and he was the anchor that kept her tethered to the living world. Alara pushed. Her shoulders burned as she shoved against the weight of the debris above. It wasn't the heavy timber of the floorboards she moved, but the charred, broken skeleton of the cabin. She heaved, gasping as the air from the cellar finally met the open sky. She climbed out, her boots slipping on the slick, blackened mud. The world had been wiped clean. The cabin was gone, reduced to a jagged pile of smoking ash and twisted metal. It was a mirror of the ranch she had left behind, a cycle of fire and ruin. The air was thick, metallic, with the scent of gunpowder and scorched earth. Bodies lay strewn across the clearing, like discarded dolls in the gray dawn light. The men who had come to claim the valley were silent now, their arrogance extinguished by the same fire they had brought to her doorstep. She turned, her eyes scanning the ruin, until she found him. Vance was slumped against a charred post that still remained standing, a lonely sentinel amidst the debris. His head was bowed, his rifle discarded inches from his hand. He was dead, the fight finally wrung out of him. Near his limp fingers lay the shattered remains of the glass jar, the silver badge lying in the dirt, tarnished, rusted, and finally free of its container. He had held the line, and in doing so he had found his way home. Alara looked away. Not out of cowardice, but out of respect. There was no time for mourning. Not yet. A low, wet wheeze drew her attention to the center of the clearing. Mayor Corbin was there, dragging his body through the soot. His leg, shattered by the blast, trailed behind him like a broken branch, leaving a dark, viscous smear on the ground. The megaphone he had used to broadcast his hollow promises was crushed under a beam, a useless piece of tin. He looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide and leaking terror. The mayor of the county, the architect of the drought, was reduced to a wounded animal. He saw her, and for a moment his gaze flickered with a remnant of his old authority before it curdled into pleading. "Alara," he gasped, his voice a jagged tear in the silence. He reached out a trembling, soot-stained hand. "Help me, please. My leg, the blood." Alara stepped over a beam, her boots crunching on broken glass. She stopped a few feet from him, looking down with a detachment so profound it chilled the air. "My husband said that to you," she said. Her voice was steady, resonant. "When the barns were burning, when the water was cut off, he begged you for his life." Corbin sobbed, the sound pathetic and thin. "It was business, just business. I can fix this. I have money in town, I have influence. You're just a girl, you don't know what you're doing. Let me live. And I'll make you the richest woman in the territory." He was still trying to negotiate. He still thought the world was a ledger he could balance with enough ink and coin. Alara looked down at the baby in her arms, then back at the man who had tried to build a kingdom on the bones of her family. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm just a girl." She leaned down, her movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. She picked up Vance's revolver from the dust. It was heavy, warm from the heat of the fire, and smelled of ozone. Corbin's eyes darted to the weapon, his bravado shattered. "No, wait, I'm a mother. she interrupted. She didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the finality of a closing door. She pulled the trigger. The shot was a sharp, clean crack that echoed off the canyon walls, silencing the mayor's gasping forever. The clearing went quiet again. The smoke began to thin as the morning breeze pushed across the mountain. Elara stood there for a long moment, the revolver heavy in her hand. She checked the chamber, then lowered the hammer and tucked the weapon into her waistband. She reached into her pocket and felt the stiff, crinkled edge of the deed, the hydrology report, the map of the reservoir, the proof of her future. She wrapped the baby more tightly in his blanket, shielding him from the sight of the ashes and the dead. She turned her back on the ruins, on Vance, and on the man in the dirt. She began to walk. The path down the mountain was steep, the trail treacherous with loose shale and shadowed by the towering pines. She didn't look back. She didn't pause to see if the fire had truly burned itself out. With every step, the mountain air grew clearer. The scent of wood smoke faded, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of pine needles and damp earth. She was heading toward the town, toward the courthouse, the sheriff's office, and the people who had been lied to for far too long. She walked with a pace that was purposeful and unhurried. Her boots crunched on the gravel, a steady, rhythmic, and unbreakable sound. It was the sound of a woman who had walked through the fire and emerged, not as a widow, but as the owner of the valley. The sun crested the ridge, casting long shadows across her path. Elara didn't squint. She kept her eyes forward, toward the horizon, and kept walking, one step then the next, claiming the world that was hers to hold.